Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this UKLFI Charitable Trust webinar, where we will focus on the question, must Israel cooperate with UNRWA? The question arises from the significant controversy over this UN organisation, which increased with evidence of the direct involvement of UNRWA personnel in terrorism and its complicity and support for Hamas. This prompted Israel's parliament to pass legislation by overwhelming bi-partisan majorities in October 2024, prohibiting any contact between the Israeli state authorities and the organisation UNRWA, and prohibiting any activity of UNRWA on Israeli territory. Following numerous reports over the years by the NGO UNWatch, with evidence of extensive infiltration of UNRWA by Hamas, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has stated that UNRWA has become a subsidiary of Hamas and will not play any role in humanitarian supplies to the Gaza Strip. Against this background, on the 22nd of October 2025, the International Court of Justice produced a further non-binding advisory opinion to the UN General Assembly on issues pertaining to Israel, and it concluded that Israel must not cooperate with, that it must indeed cooperate with UNRWA and other UN agencies. So, to discuss this opinion in light of the evidence about UNRWA that UNWatch in particular has publicised, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Hillel Neuer, Executive Director of UNWatch, a human rights NGO in Geneva. In 2016, the city of Chicago declared Hillel Neuer Day. Hillel, it cited you as one of the world's foremost human rights advocates. I wasn't aware of this, but congratulations. And in 2018, McGill University awarded you an honorary doctorate for your work to advance human rights. The Tribune de Genève has described Neuer as a human rights activist who is feared and dreaded by the world's dictatorships. And in 2007, Neuer's banned speech on the hypocrisy of the UN Human Rights Council became the most viewed NGO speech in the UN's history. Where Are Your Jews has been viewed over 11 million times on Facebook and YouTube. Since 2009, Neuer has headed a coalition of 25 human rights groups as chair of the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, which provides a forum for pro-democracy dissidents around the world. Neuer is also a member of the New York Bar and practiced commercial and civil rights litigation at an international law firm in New York before joining UNWatch. And I know that last week you set the Oxford Union right in a debate about Israel and Iran. So I shall look forward to the videos on that, Hillel. It's wonderful to be able to welcome you to this webinar series.
Thank you, Natasha, for the very kind introduction, and indeed for you and UKLFI for inviting me to this event today. And let's go straight into it. It's really a very topical matter. The issue of what happens next in Gaza, the peace of the Middle East, will depend very much on the role of UNRWA. And so let's go right into the opinion. In late October, the International Court of Justice published an advisory opinion at the request of the UN General Assembly. The previous year, the General Assembly had passed a resolution calling on the court to give its opinion on the question of what are the obligations of Israel in relation to UN and other international organizations in the territories, including their obligations to facilitate and ensure delivery of aid in support of various Palestinian rights, including Palestinian self-determination. So sort of a very loaded question. It's not strictly about delivering aid, but at the end of the sentence of the question is in support of Palestinian self-determination. So the question is quite loaded. And if one reads the resolution that requests the court to issue the advisory opinion, the resolution itself is hardly impartial or neutral. The resolution includes numerous paragraphs criticizing Israel, calling on Israel to stop doing various violations, alleged violations, And the resolution has very lengthy praise of UNRWA and endorsements of UNRWA. So again, the very UN resolution requesting the ICJ to deliver an advisory opinion itself kind of prejudices the question and the answer by making its own determinations again about Israel's violations and about the vital necessity of UNRWA. Okay, so the court was asked to do this. It's obviously a political process. One question is whether the court needs to accede every time the UN General Assembly, every time some majority of dictatorships asks the ICJ to give an opinion. Are the judges obliged to do so? Not necessarily. They probably could say, you know what, this is something that is the court's being politicized, and we don't necessarily have to answer it. But that's not what they did in this case, or in other similar cases. They go along with this politicized process. I should indicate that among those calling on the court are not just Arab states, but Norway took a leading role in pushing this resolution. It's, as Natasha indicated, it was kind of done in response to Israeli legislation, that Israel adopted two laws that restricted the work of UNRWA. One law dealt with UNRWA's activities in Israel proper, in Jerusalem. There was a major office of UNRWA in Jerusalem, and one of the two Israeli statutes basically prohibited the activity of UNRWA in Israel, which in practice means in Jerusalem. That's part one. That includes the large compound they had there, as well as a so-called refugee camp in Jerusalem, which is basically the UNRWA facilities there are not supposed to operate. So that was one law. The second law was saying that Israeli officials are barred from interacting, from dealing with UNRWA staff in the territories or anywhere, basically. And of course, UNRWA has a significant amount of staff in Gaza and the West Bank. In Gaza, 13,000, and in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, about 4,000 staff. And Israeli authorities are barred from dealing with them. So those are the two laws. And this, you could say that this opinion was triggered as a rebuke to Israel's actions. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the whole opinion. I'm just going to focus on the part about UNRWA, talk to you about what the court ruled, and share with you my own thoughts on that. So the court made various determinations about UNRWA. I'm reading now from page 41 of the opinion, which is in paragraph 114. So the International Court of Justice notes that based on the case file, there is no evidence that UNRWA as an entity breached the principle of impartiality. And they quote the Colonna report, which they say did not make any findings calling UNRWA's impartiality into question. So what is the Colonna report? I'll give you a bit of the timeline briefly. October 7th, 2023, the war begins. And several months later, in January of 2024, so about 4 months later, the Israeli Foreign Ministry reveals that several UNRWA staff were actually involved in the massacre. Individual UNRWA employees were involved in perpetrating the massacre. And that triggers several things. One is the UNRWA chief says, okay, he's going to fire these people until they investigate further. And numerous countries froze funding. We saw for most of them that was performative, and they immediately reinstated just a few months later. But the US was the big one to freeze funding, and the US never came back to give funding again since January 2024. And the UNRWA and the UN announced a independent review of UNRWA. And they asked Catherine Colonna, the French foreign minister, former French foreign minister, to head this so-called independent review. And I can share with you that the motive of the independent review may have actually begun before these revelations. because we had revealed something about this. The revelations of the UNRWA staff being involved in the massacre was the end of January. But around January 10th, UNWatch had revealed the Terrorgram, a chat group, Telegram, for UNRWA teachers in Gaza, in which 3,000 members were on this group, and many of them were celebrating the massacre as it was happening on October 7th. So we revealed numerous UNRWA staff involved in cheering on the massacre in a chat group. That made quite a storm around the world. And actually, if I recall, Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, began this review exercise in response to that. But then it got bigger when the revelations were made about the staff involved in the massacre. Okay, now the ICJ cites the Colonna report. You need to know about the Colonna report. The Colonna report was rigged. The Colonna report was rigged. I'm looking if I can, there's a chat group. I'm going to see actually if I can drop in while I'm speaking to you. Just going to go quickly on unwatch.org. Going to go to case against UNRWA and reports. And I want to send you the Colonna report being
We can
rigged.
also certainly follow up, Hillel, with those links in our email to participants after the webinar.
Good. Okay. So I'm just, yeah, right. So this is an essential document actually, because it's relied upon by many governments, basically all Western governments that fund UNRWA rely on this report. So I'm sending you report how the Colonna report was rigged. Okay, so I just sent it in the chat, and I think that goes to everyone. Okay, and Natasha will share that afterwards. But this is very important to understand. So the Colonna report, they asked the French foreign minister, the former French foreign minister, to head a review. There were 3 Scandinavian NGOs that were going to be the secretariat, do the legwork, and everything was rigged. Okay, first of all, the secretariat, these are groups that are incredibly pro-UNRWA. Like the leading champions of UNRWA were involved, individuals and organizations that hate Israel. All of that's exposed in the report that I shared with you here in the chat. So those conducting the review were extremely anti-Israel, extremely pro-UNRWA. And the French foreign minister herself was someone who was a donor to UNRWA on behalf of France and had praised UNRWA a lot. And the heads of UNRWA, Lazzarini, and his spokesman, former spokesman, but still acting as a surrogate, Chris Gunness said in an interview, in an article, he said that the whole point of the Colonna review is, he didn't say it's to find wrongdoing or complicity with terror, but he said it's to allow donor states to climb down the tree and save face because they had frozen funding. Basically, the US asked their allies to join them in freezing funding. So they froze funding, but they wanted to climb down. And the whole point of the Colonna review, said Chris Gunness, surrogate of UNRWA, is to allow them to save face. In other words, it's just a maneuver. And Colonna herself said the point was to reassure the donors. So the whole thing was rigged in advance, and our report gives you much more detail on that. So if you can't find it, you just go on unwatch.org. There's a section on UNRWA, and you look for a report called Exposed UNRWA's Rigged Independent Review, and then you can find it. Okay, so the point is that the Colonna report was a sham. Okay, it took them a couple of months, and she gave a report. She found a few things here or there that were problematic, but the main message of the report was everything is fine. Everything is fine, and indeed, not only is everything fine, but actually UNRWA has more mechanisms for accountability than any other group in the world. Okay, so they really went very extreme findings, how incredible UNRWA is. And the UNRWA and this Colonna review ignored a lot of our evidence, which I'll share with you in a moment. Okay, so that's the Colonna report. The Colonna report was a rigged report designed to appear as an independent review. But the conclusions were fixed in advance, and everyone knew that they were going to find that UNRWA is great. And indeed, their findings repeated the mantra. The defenders of UNRWA have a mantra, which is UNRWA is a lifeline, and it's the humanitarian backbone, lifeline, lifesaver. Okay, this is the mantra of the UNRWA talking points, and the Colonna report parroted those talking points. So they didn't even make a great effort to mask their propaganda, if you will say. Okay, now we're going back to the ICJ opinion. The ICJ opinion, I'm now in paragraph 117. Israel alleged that UNRWA has been infiltrated by Hamas and other terrorist organizations. But, says the court in paragraph 118, the court considers the information before it is not sufficient to establish UNRWA's lack of neutrality. Okay, insufficient evidence to show that UNRWA lacks neutrality. The UN took Israel's allegations seriously and responded immediately as evidenced by the OIOS, that's the internal investigation, and the Colonna report. Indeed, says the court, it says the fact, Israel pointed to the fact that there were 9 UNRWA employees who were dismissed. This, however, is insufficient to support a conclusion that UNRWA as a whole, with more than 17,000 employees in the Palestinian territory, or 30,000 altogether, is not a neutral organization, right? The fact that there's a few bad apples doesn't mean anything about an organization that has 30,000 staff. Indeed, says the court, prompt action following allegations of illegal conduct may be a strong indicator of neutrality. So the fact that UNRWA took prompt action is a strong indicator of neutrality. And then they go on, they quote the Colonna report. The court notes that the Colonna report concluded that, quote, UNRWA has established a significant number of mechanisms and procedures to ensure compliance with humanitarian principles, with an emphasis on neutrality, and it possesses, listen to this, a more developed approach to neutrality than other similar UN or NGO entities. So UNRWA is significant number of mechanisms and procedures for neutrality, and they have a more developed approach than other similar UN or NGO entities. The Colonna report, says the court, made a number of recommendations to UNRWA, and the UN has indicated that UNRWA is implementing them. Okay, so the UN told us that UNRWA is implementing the recommendations. Therefore, rules the court, paragraph 124, thus, the court considers that Israel is under an obligation to facilitate relief schemes provided by the UN and its entities, including UNRWA. So Israel's obliged to deal with UNRWA, and there's no indication factually that there is a lack of neutrality. That's what the court found. Now let me tell you the truth. Okay, the truth is that if you go on our website, UNWatch.org, there's a section on UNRWA. I just shared with you one report, but I'm going to share with you also the larger section itself. Here is the section, and that's our section on UNRWA. You will see there a mountain of reports, which we began sending to UNRWA about 10 years ago. Okay, more than 10 years ago, we began sending to UNRWA reports of their staff, teachers and other staff. They have, as indicated, 30,000 staff. In Gaza is 13,000. They have in the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. We sent them detailed reports on their staff who were inciting anti-Semitism, who were saying, in the name of Allah, you have to kill every Jew you see, praising Adolf Hitler, regularly celebrating terrorist attacks by Hamas. And we sent their names, screenshots. We didn't do anything fancy. We just went on Facebook. We discovered these posts, and we sent them to UNRWA. Their response was not give us more information, was not prompt action, was the opposite. Okay, if the court had a modicum of decency, they would have taken note that UNRWA's response, whenever we reported illegal conduct, violation of neutrality, was promoting terrorism is much worse than just violating neutrality. The response of UNRWA invariably was to deny, was to attack us, was to smear us, to say UNWatch hates refugees, hates Palestinians, and the opposite of taking it seriously, of contacting us. We reached out to them, offered to meet them, they refused to meet. All of this is well documented in detail in our reports, and we actually sent it to the Colonna report. We sent these details to the Colonna report. They never contacted me, and they didn't include any of it. So for 10 years, we sent them numerous reports. And I'm just going to share with you one of our, and again, their reaction was not prompt action. It was the opposite. We have, and here's I think it's the final thing I'm going to send you. Okay. I'll send you two more things, actually. Two more things. One is the UNRWA Terror Network. We recently published a diagram of about 500 individuals and their connections, UNRWA individuals, and their connections to the UNRWA Terror Network. You can see that's a live diagram that shows you all kinds of UNRWA individuals and how they people involved in terrorism and their connections to other senior UNRWA personalities and staff, including Lazzarini and others, who regularly interact with people who are either Hamas terrorists or promote terrorism. So that's the UNRWA Terror Network. The final document that I'm going to share here, excuse me for sharing all this stuff, but it is important, is going to be our last report called Schools in the Grip of Terror. Schools in the Grip of Terror. And that's the final document that I'm going to share, Schools in the Grip of Terror. You folks can hold on to your questions till the end. I'll answer questions at the end. Schools in the Grip of Terror, that's the final report. Okay, so in Schools in the Grip of Terror, which we released about a month and a half ago, we documented how the heads of UNRWA's education system are not just supporters of Hamas, supporters of terror, but actual Hamas terrorists. Okay, I'm going to say that again. The heads of education at UNRWA are leading Hamas terrorists. I'm going to mention case study of Gaza and Lebanon. In Gaza, the head of the teachers union and eventually head of the entire staff union was a teacher, a school principal named Suhail al-Hindi. Suhail al-Hindi. Suhail al-Hindi, in addition to being a teacher, school principal, and head of 8,000 UNRWA teachers, the union in Gaza, was also an elected member of the Hamas Political Bureau. I'll say that again. The head of 8,000 teachers being paid by your salaries. If you're a Western taxpayer, you paid his salary, we paid his salary for many years. He was there for 27 years. And he was a elected member of the Hamas Politburo. There are pictures of him, you'll see in our report, pictures of him with Yahya Sinwar. They were on the Hamas Politburo together. And he was a known Hamas figure. Everyone in Gaza knew he was in Hamas. It was public. He was a Hamas guy his whole life. And UNRWA didn't do anything about it. Israel complained several times. Finally, in 2017, when it became impossible, or it seemed impossible for Israel, for Hamas, for UNRWA to deny his links, Israel complained again, said, look, it's published on a website that he's an elected member of the Hamas Politburo. And UNRWA's reaction actually was no. Their first reaction, Chris Gunnis, the spokesman, was we asked the gentleman, and he said no. There's no truth to this allegation, and he knows nothing about the matter. He doesn't know anything about it. But eventually, the evidence was so damning that UNRWA couldn't sustain that lie, and they let him go. They either let him resign or they fired him. We don't really know. And then he became more overtly Hamas, and he was the head of the March of Return, which was the forerunner to October 7th, these violent riots on the border orchestrated by Hamas to probe the fences and so forth, to probe Israel's security systems. He was the chair of that, or co-chair of that. And he's a Hamas spokesman. He now lives in Turkey. He's one of the Hamas terrorist chiefs living in Turkey. When the Iranian foreign minister visited Qatar recently, I think about a month ago, Suhail al-Hindi was one of the Hamas leaders opposite him in Qatar. So one of the leaders of Hamas was a leader of education at UNRWA. And again, he's been gone since 2017, but he's still very involved in what happens there because he's an expert at UNRWA. The subsequent union chiefs work with him very much. And our report in 100 pages, Schools in the Grip of Terror, documents how he and his successors continue to be either Hamas leaders or working closely with them. So that's Gaza. Okay, again, the ICJ found no proof that there's a problem with impartiality, yet The head of 8,000 teachers and the head of the entire staff union was a Hamas terror chief for many years. Okay. So imagine the schools under him, the teachers under him, the staff under him, right? The whole thing is absurd. And again, in our UNRWA terror network, we document about 500 people who support terrorism. It's not a few bad apples. The apple is rotten to the core. It's systemic. It's systemic. That's Gaza. Let's look at Lebanon. Again, our report, Schools in the Grip of Terror, part 2 of the report, looks at a very similar story, Fathi al-Sharif. Fathi al-Sharif in Lebanon, not Gaza, we're in Lebanon. Fathi al-Sharif is a teacher, a school principal for 30 years, and also head of the teachers union, head of 2,000 UNRWA teachers. Again, we paid his staff. If you've been paying taxes in the past 30 years, your money in part went to UNRWA and you paid his salary. Fathi al-Sharif was eliminated a year ago in September 2024. An IDF missile arrived at his home and eliminated Fathi al-Sharif. Justice was delivered to him. And the day that he was killed, Hamas issued a statement saying, well, why would Hamas issue a statement? I just told you he's the UNRWA teacher, school principal, and head of the UNRWA teachers union of 2,000 teachers. Why would Hamas issue a statement? That's odd. Well, the Hamas statement said, Israel killed our leader. Okay. Hamas announced on September 24th, something like that. I forget the exact date, but September last year, that that the elimination, when Fathi al-Sharif was killed, Israel eliminated the leader of Hamas. They posted a video hailing his jihadi education. He gave us jihadi education, right? The British Foreign Office and all the other foreign ministries say we're giving money to UNRWA because they're protecting human rights values, UN values. If UNRWA would be gone, what would happen? UNRWA last week, in the height of audacity, Philippe Lazzarini said, you know, the war the past 2 years has radicalized people. They've suffered so much. There's a danger that they're getting radicalized. And the cure for radicalization is UNRWA. UNRWA education is the cure for radicalization. And what I'm telling you, what I'm showing you in the various reports is the exact opposite, that the heads of the education system in Lebanon, the head of 2,000 teachers, was the head of Hamas, that Hamas said he gave jihadi education. We hail him for his jihadi education. They posted the video, images of him walking around with armed bodyguards. He was the capo di tutti capi, the mafia boss in his UNRWA neighborhoods in Lebanon. And pictures of him with Ismail Haniyeh, the late head of Hamas, who was also eliminated when he was visiting Tehran. So that's Fathi Sharif. Now, when this came out, the UN and UNRWA said, well, we didn't know. How could we know? And actually they said, well, you know, in the last year of his life, when a complaint was filed, either by Israel or someone else filed a complaint, they suspended him, which is true. After 30 years of his activity, when a formal complaint was made, they suspended him, but they didn't fire him. And there were riots and very angry protests all across UNRWA in Lebanon saying, don't you dare suspend Fathi al-Sharif. But the point is, and our report shows, that for at least a decade of Facebook posts that we have, he was, again, the UN said, how could we know? How could we know? You know, the UN spokesman in New York, Stefan Dujarric, said, when people do undercover activity, they don't typically publicize it. So how could we know? Well, the opposite is true, because he was hiding in plain sight. He wasn't hiding it. He advertised it every day. And in part 2 of our report, Schools in the Grip of Terror, we document page after page how Fathi al-Sharif, in a Facebook page where many of his Facebook friends were UNRWA colleagues, he said, I love Hamas, pictures of Hamas leaders, pictures of him holding the coffin at funerals for Hamas terrorists, pictures of him on community websites in Lebanon, Palestinian websites, where he's giving out prizes to little kids with a Hamas headband as they're learning karate in the tribute to Hamas martyrs, the founders of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. So he's there with little kids learning Hamas brainwashing, their minds being poisoned, and pictures of him whenever he would do an engagement party for his 2 sons, photos of him in the front row with terror chiefs from Al-Qaeda, an affiliate in Lebanon of Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, proudly posting these photos. Again, he's a teacher, school principal, a UN teacher. There's a UN flag right behind me, the blue flag. That's not what it's supposed to be about. Um, School principal and head of 2,000 teachers. So that's Fathi al-Sharif. Again, he was eliminated a year ago, but those replacing him, our report shows, continue to be affiliated with Hamas. So to wrap up, ladies and gentlemen, the ICJ could find no evidence that there's a lack of neutrality, and yet, as our reports show with compelling evidence showing the UNRWA and Hamas people themselves, the opposite is true. Thank you.
Hillel, thank you so much for that overview. It's extremely important because it strikes me, and I think the impression from many of those already posing questions is that this information simply hasn't been getting through, not to the governments involved in funding UNRWA and reinstituting funds to UNRWA, but certainly not to the general public through the media. And I should say that we previously did a webinar on UNRWA, the legal cases, which set out a great deal of the detail around the legal measures that were taken by Israel, but also what we anticipated hearing from the ICJ in its advisory opinion. And I can't say that we were particularly surprised on that basis. Thank you for setting out the approach that that opinion has taken. It does seem to be that there is this whitewashing of all of the evidence that you, together with UNWatch, have presented about UNRWA and its complicity in funding terrorism, supporting terrorism, and in so many respects, actually executing terrorism. It's remarkable, it seems to me, that there's no coverage in the advisory opinion also of the diversion of aid by Hamas, of hostages, really. I think there's one reference as a by the by to the tunnels in Gaza and Hamas's use of those, some of which, of course, have been shielded by UNRWA facilities. So this is an opinion that leaves a great deal to be desired, for sure. But there's just one aspect of this that I wanted to pick up before we move on to questions. And albeit there've already been there's already been a steady flow of questions, I'll encourage anyone else that wishes to pose questions to you to include those in the Q&A facility on Zoom, and I'll be putting them to you from there. This concerns not just Israel's obligations, real obligations under international law, but those of the international community. And it actually formed part of a UK Lawyers for Israel submission to the ICJ in advance of it considering these matters for the advisory opinion. For those of you in the audience who might wish to read this, it's paragraphs 55 to 71 of our submission, which is available on the UKLFI website. And it concerns obligations to prevent terror activities. Now, certainly Israel has the obligation, in light of everything that you have discussed, obligations that require it to prevent UNRWA and its staff from engaging in or facilitating terrorist activities on its own territory. I'd include in those the 1997 International Convention for the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings, also the 1999 Convention for the Suppression of Financing of Terrorism. And of course, there's also the extremely well-known UN Security Council resolution, an unusual binding UN Security Council resolution made under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter that was adopted just after the 9/11 attacks in 2001, Resolution 1373, which requires all member states of the UN to take measures against terrorism, in particular terror financing. All of that, of course, has seemingly been set aside by this advisory opinion, which will be critical, I think, when we come to answer the question that I posed right at the start, which is the question at the core of this webinar: must Israel cooperate with UNRWA in light of this international law that says it seems the opposite? And there's one other aspect that I would just like to highlight, and I can't recall if it's raised by a powerful dissenting opinion by Julia Sebutinde, but it is important, and it's the obligation that is claimed. So that this is the position that if Israel were an occupying power in the Gaza Strip, and this is the proposed position that many seek to advance. I personally think there are substantial flaws to it, but if we were to take that argument at its highest, then we have Article 43 of the Hague Convention, which applies to occupying powers that are responsible for the public health and safety. And in light of everything that you have described, of UNRWA being at the core of so many of these terrorist activities by Hamas, then quite the contrary, there seems to be an additional obligation on Israel to prevent UNRWA from facilitating terror, not just against Israelis, but also against the local population in Gaza. I don't know, I'm asking you in a kind of general terms before we leap into the Q&A, whether you've encountered any discussion in the international fora that you frequent of this flip side, this very important international law obligations that exist to in fact combat UNRWA in light of the important evidence that you have highlighted and publicized.
The short answer is I have not seen in international fora any consideration of this obligation on Israel to counter the terrorism that UNRWA is facilitating and promoting, which, as you indicate, harms many, and that's shameful, shameful indeed.
Um, Again, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative just because just before I move on to the questions that we've had come in, I also want to highlight one important aspect which I don't recall seeing in the advisory opinion at all, and that concerns Israel's direct agreement with UNRWA dating from 1967. And this concerns an exchange of letters just after the 1967 war about the facilitation of UNRWA activities subject to regulations or arrangements which may be necessitated by considerations of military security. That's, I think, one important aspect of this exchange of letters, but also an acknowledgement that this agreement that facilitated UNRWA's activities in these territories from the outset was a provisional agreement which will remain in force until replaced or cancelled. And that struck me as particularly important, firstly, because, of course, it emphasised UNRWA's intended temporary nature, but also because it underscores what is at the core of so much of international law, which is the sovereignty of individual states, such as Israel, and that essential right to be the arbiter of what happens on your sovereign territory. And again, this opinion appears to throw that out of the window, something I would just highlight as particularly troubling, not just for Israel, but because of the precedent that it seeks to set for establishing these sorts of principles on a broader basis. I say seeks to set because realistically speaking, this is an advisory opinion which does not have any binding effect, but very much seeks to, it seems to me, push international law in that particular direction. Hillel, one of the core retorts that I certainly hear from those in the international community seeking to prop up UNRWA is that there's no realistic alternative. Now, I don't know if there have been any real attempts by the UN to find one, but what do you make of that charge that absent UNRWA, matters would simply be lost in this arena?
Yeah, look, I think it's an important question, and I'm going to come to it in a moment. Let's just highlight the fact that that is certainly not what either the ICJ or the other or UNRWA's supporters, which are many, um, they don't say, yes, we recognize that you have documented, and we should know because we know them too, that UNRWA is completely infested with Hamas terrorists at the very top. But practically, what are we going to do, right? That would be one thing where you could have a good faith discussion. They don't do that, right? It's complete denial that UNRWA, certainly in Hamas and in Gaza and Lebanon, are infested by terrorists. They completely deny that. So that's the first thing to emphasize. And then the question itself, let's say, if there's a good faith discussion saying, okay, we acknowledge everything is true. Is it true that UNRWA is indispensable? And the short answer is no. Over time, certainly in the war, UNRWA became less and less involved in distributing aid. Israel gradually gave that to other agencies. And I think at one point they were maybe down to handling 10% of the aid that was being distributed in Gaza. So it's already a fait accompli that we know that UNRWA was not involved in a majority of the distribution of aid. Now, of course, they do have 13,000 employees, and what they tried to do was, Antonio Guterres, when other UN agencies said we might be willing to step in, and when the United States, which ended its funding to UNRWA in January 2024, when they said we're looking for other agencies, Guterres clearly issued, and this was reported in various news reports, basically sent a directive to the other UN agencies saying, if you dare to volunteer to replace UNRWA, I'll break your legs. Okay, that was the gist of his comment, like a mafia kind of thing. And sure enough, there was some letter went out signed by, I don't know, 25 different UN agency chiefs saying UNRWA is sacrosanct. We can never replace UNRWA. And as a matter of pragmatic logistics, it's baloney. What is UNRWA doing? They run schools, they run medical stuff, and they give out aid. There is the notion that only UNRWA can give out boxes of aid is absurd. I'm in Geneva, across the street from the UN Refugee Agency. They know how to fly into a crisis area weeks into a crisis, far away in Africa or other places, and to, within a short amount of time, managing a cluster of international, either UN or other international organizations to, give out boxes of food to millions of people. It's not perfect, but they know how to do it. So the notion that in tiny Gaza, no other agencies can do it is absurd. The only reason that the UN and UNRWA have said that UNRWA is irreplaceable and only they can do it is because only UNRWA has the pathological political agenda, which is to dismantle Israel. And let's be clear, the raison d'etre of UNRWA today, it wasn't the raison d'etre when it was founded, it had altruistic beginnings, but in practice today, UNRWA's message is that if you live in Gaza, Gaza is not your home. Your home is in Israel, in Haifa, in Lod, and so in Jaffa, and so forth. That's what the Palestinians are taught in all of the UNRWA schools, and that's the only way that UNRWA is irreplaceable is because the other UN agencies don't have that pathological agenda. And so the UN is trying to exploit the aid issue to maintain an agency whose true purpose is to destroy Israel, to tell Palestinians they have the right to dismantle Israel.
One of the questions, Hillel, in the Q&A actually goes to that concept of Palestinian refugee. It asks, should we draw attention to the fact that UNRWA created all subsequent generations to be known as Palestinian refugees? I wasn't entirely aware that it's only UNRWA that is promoting that particular narrative, but given their very concrete involvement in it, what avenues do you see being able to call that out and, in a sense, free future generations of Palestinians from being indoctrinated into that particular dogma?
Yes, well, in the general rule is that that refugee status is not transferred from a parent to a child. Just to show you how absurd UNRWA is, in Jordan, most of the 2 million UNRWA beneficiaries, who are called refugees, are Jordanian citizens. So you have approximately 2 million Jordanian citizens who have had Jordanian passports for 70 years. And according to the UN, they're refugees, which is absurd. There's no such thing in the world as a citizen refugee. If you're living in a country safely, you're not a refugee. But the UN tells these 2 million Jordanians that they have basically a right or a duty to, quote unquote, return, which means to dismantle Israel. So this is really absurd. And indeed, the UN Refugee Agency, they don't follow the same rules.
Quite a few people are asking about the input of the media, and the BBC comes up a great deal in light of the particular controversy here in the United Kingdom. But what is your opinion on the role that the media have played, and have you seen the allegations and the evidence that UNWatch and others have put out with respect to UNRWA being picked up in any credible way by the BBC and others? And if not, do you have any thoughts on how one might be able to properly address that?
Well, certainly in the UK, I was in the UK last week speaking in the Parliament about UNRWA, and certainly the issue of the scandal with the BBC systemic bias exposed was something that's been very much discussed in the UK. And speaking about the BBC, I will note that, again, Chris Gunness, who was really the face of UNRWA for the past decade and a half, if not more, is ex-BBC. He's a former BBC journalist. And, the Guardian, the BBC, and UNRWA, they are in lockstep. And lockstep with the mantra that UNRWA is a humanitarian lifeline that is saving lives and is irreplaceable. And so certainly that is the BBC line. And I don't know that they've covered um, our reports in recent years or ever. We've been on the BBC on rare occasion, but on UNRWA, we haven't been there. We did many years ago, we were in the Times of London, in the Times, about UN teachers called to kill Jews. So that was a long time ago. But certainly in the past 2 years, it was seen by many in the media that they had to circle wagons and all join behind UNRWA and not to report honestly about the findings that we've had and how to address it. I don't have a silver bullet. We did get our reports recently in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which is a serious newspaper out of Switzerland. It's widely read in Germany. We were in La Stampa. So we did manage to get our reports in some places, but there is a very strong resistance from many in the media not to report this story.
Understood. And I think those watching will be painfully aware of that. One question asks, please deal with the legal rationale that the ICJ used to determine that Israel is obliged to cooperate with UNRWA. But perhaps I might start on that briefly and please pitch in if you have any additional thoughts. But quoting from the ICJ press release, I can say that they've determined that Israel, as the occupying power, is obligated under international law to ensure the basic needs of the Palestinian population are met, including humanitarian aid. Now, I think separately in the webinar I mentioned, we deal with the underlying assumptions there that Israel is an occupying power in Gaza at the time that this advisory opinion was being sought. But of course, as you indicated at the very beginning, the question that the General Assembly posed to the ICJ was laden with these assumptions, one of them being that it presupposed that Israel was the occupying power. There's been a previous ICJ advisory opinion that determines that essentially Israel is in illegal occupation, a concept that doesn't, frankly, exist anywhere else. Occupation is a state of affairs. Its legality or otherwise is simply not addressed more broadly in international law. But as I say, these advisory opinions are just opinions, and they are as valuable, I would argue, as the legal analysis and factual analysis that goes into them, which has left something to be desired. Just in terms of how that is fleshed out by the court, it might help if I just set out that there is, as a result of their determination that Israel is an occupying power, an obligation, they say, to facilitate relief, a duty to ensure that the population has essential supplies and to facilitate relief schemes, particularly in Gaza. Now, there it is, of course, important to recognise the factual situation in terms of the volume of aid that has gone into Gaza. Again, something that is not dealt with by the ICJ in this advisory opinion or in other respects. The indispensable role of UNRWA is focused on by the court. And that is that they are a unique mandate with a connection to the population that cannot be replaced by other entities in the current circumstances. The ICJ also talks about the humanitarian consequences that restrictions on access to aid and the deprivation of aid have caused. So they use that as a basis for claiming that there is a violation of human rights and international humanitarian law. Cooperation with the UN is a key in this advisory opinion and the obligations on member states to cooperate with the UN. So that is cited in a way that simply appears to trump the agreement that I mentioned earlier between Israel and the UN, which I would also argue is an inversion of how international law operates. But primarily, one of the key planks here is a lack of evidence, and the court said that Israel had not substantiated its allegations that UNRWA was infiltrated by Hamas and other terrorist groups, and you have dealt with that already in your opening remarks. So I've taken the liberty of dealing with that question, Hillel, but I don't know if there's anything that you want to add in terms of the rationale that the court adopted, which I've sought to summarize as briefly as possible. Given, of course, the realities of the facts and the law as we've set them out thus far.
No, I think you've stated it very clearly. They've made legal presumptions to the prejudice of Israel. Israel pulled out 20 years ago from Gaza, handed the whole thing over to the Palestinians, and the UN, various UN and other um, figures created this entirely bizarre concept in law that even though you're not on the ground, you're somehow still an occupier, and that was done just to for Israel to prejudice Israel and to use it as a way to beat Israel as a weapon against Israel.
Well, look, you certainly know how to flatter your moderator. I will give you that. So on that basis, on the basis of everything we've said, one questioner asks, is it not time for Israel and the USA to disengage from the UN, in effect disbanding the United Nations? Now, as the head of UNWatch, do you have anything in particular to pitch in on that question?
Well, look, the UN is not going away. That's just the reality. Potentially Donald Trump could say walk away from the UN, though there's no indication that he's doing that. But even if he did, maybe he could get two or three others in the world to join it. But none of the major democracies are joining. The British, the French, the Germans, the Canadians, the Australians, they're not joining. For them, the UN is just fine. And so, unfortunately, it's not going away. And you could get some countries to pull out of a given UN procedure. The United States is sanctioning certain UN people. They're sanctioning Francesca Albanese. They're sanctioning some ICC judges and prosecutors. But the UN is there, and we have to try to get our countries to do the right thing. Certainly today, it's very hard.
A couple of particular questions. Our focus has been Gaza, but as to UNRWA's activities in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank, one asks, what have 4,000 UNRWA staff to do in Judea and Samaria? And is this in areas C, B, or A? And another says, after all is said and done, is UNRWA still present in Judea and Samaria? And if so, how does UNRWA deal with forgive me, how does Israel deal with UNRWA in light of that legislation? Are you able to speak to the West Bank in this respect?
Yeah, so the staff, I mean, you have to understand that UNRWA is in part a welfare state. Right? It's a massive welfare state, $1.5 billion, giving food to Palestinians, medical care, money. It's a massive welfare state, which allowed Hamas, of course, to spend all their time and all their money and all their resources on terrorism. And they said, "Oh, the refugees." When they were interviewed about it, why didn't you build shelters for your people? They said, "Oh, refugees, the UN has to deal with them." So the UN's obligation, we deal with the fighters. So UNRWA is a make work project. So what are 4,000 staff doing in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank? I have no idea. As I said, they run schools. So many of them are teachers, staff of various kinds. They run schools and various other things. And the other question about how has the Israeli legislation affected that? The short answer is I don't know. I know that in Gaza, Israel seems to be trying to freeze out UNRWA from resuming their monopoly. I'm not sure how that plays out in Judea and Samaria. Um, Many of the staff can go about their work and don't need cooperation with Israel. It's primarily those who are, crossing over or flying in from the international staff's probably a bit more. They probably need more cooperation. Those on the ground in, the Jenin refugee camp and so forth may not need that much the Israeli interaction. But I don't know the specifics on how that prohibition has been playing out.
Yeah, certainly the impression is that it has not been fully enforced. And then there may be practical reasons associated with that. As you say, that these are, UNRWA-run schools in many of these areas. Uh, there is a broader question that's been posed, Hillel, with respect to whether this situation is unprecedented. The questioner writes, history knows of examples where terrorists are romanticized, presented as fighters for justice, including among human rights activists, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the Red Faction in East Germany, the IRA, the Basques in Spain. What all of these organizations have in common is that they receive financial support from other countries, just like the Bolsheviks in Russia. But the questioner writes, I haven't read anything about terrorists being members of the UN, or in this case, a UN organization or the League of Nations. Are you aware? Is this a precedent in history?
It may be. I'm not aware of another precedent. I'm not aware of another precedent. Certainly to this degree, obviously at any point you could have one or two, but to this degree where you have Hamas terror chiefs, lots of them, where Israel estimates more than 1,000 in Gaza are belong to Hamas. I've never seen anything like it. Again, UNRWA is possibly unique in that it's, the entire UNHCR, the refugee agency, has 19,000 staff and they're going down to 16,000. UNRWA has 30,000. So that's 19,000 going down to 16 for the whole world. And there's 30,000 for UNRWA itself. And again, unlike other cases, the other UN staff usually are international people. UNRWA, 99% are Palestinians, are local people. So the whole thing is kind of maybe sui generis, but I'm not aware. None of that is an excuse, right? Sometimes the UN will use that as an excuse. Well, what do you want? They're local Palestinians. Of course, they're Hamas. No, that's not an excuse. If they're UN, they cannot be linked to terrorism, and I'm not aware of any precedent. So that just makes the case even stronger.
And in that respect, it's interesting to note that when the United Nations has claimed that staff members have been killed, I think rather unusually, over the last 2 years, it hasn't been releasing their names. And the implication there is perhaps because, as UNWatch has been identifying off of social media and other sources, their names would identify them as members of prescribed terrorist organizations, as you have found is the case with so many individuals. Um, Hillel, we've talked a bit about the distribution of aid in Gaza, and I know you mentioned that UNRWA has only been really responsible for some 10% of that. And of course, albeit the advisory opinion does not include any reference to this, it is common knowledge that Hamas has been diverting aid. But we do have a question as to whether UNRWA has been a conduit for actual funds to Hamas. Do you have any information on that?
No, there is a lawsuit in the US saying that UNRWA was aware and uh, may have taken action to facilitate Hamas profiting from UNRWA cash, bringing cash into Gaza, paying people in cash, requiring them to convert their money with Gaza money changers, which are Hamas, who take a commission. And so basically, by making certain requirements, they in effect hand cash over to Hamas. So that is an allegation in a very substantial court case in America. Beyond that, I'm not aware. Not aware of that.
And I should say, I'm aware, certainly in one of these proceedings in the US, that the attempt is to challenge the presumption that UNRWA has immunity, something that the court did reference, but something that is extraordinary when you consider the involvement of members of this organization in the atrocities of the 7th of October and other acts of terrorism. The fact that it would be suggested that these individuals should benefit from the immunity attaching to UN organizations. And Hillel, we only have a couple of minutes left, so I'll rush through a final couple of questions, if I may. One asks to what extent the government of Israel defended itself before the ICJ in this case. And I suppose, in a sense, this goes to the question as to whether or not it's even legitimate for an advisory opinion to be used in circumstances of this nature. There is a general expectation that advisory opinions don't rule on the rights of individual states, that states have to, in fact, consent to these sorts of proceedings. And my understanding is that while Israel did provide some information which it seems the court has not taken up, it certainly has not consented in any way to having its rights or obligations opined upon by the court. Do you have any insight into Israel's engagement?
No, my recollection is similar to yours. I think they, as you said, I think they may have shared some information, but I'm not aware that they appeared or otherwise, consented to this procedure.
And so, final question, if I may, which is, does the existence of UNRWA prevent there ever being a possibility for peace? Is its unique status within the UN regarding refugees something that seems to make the search for peace an impossibility? This is perhaps a final question to end on, and I'd value your thoughts.
Can you ask it again? The first
Um,
part?
yes, of course. The question is, I've just closed it.
It's
Does
about peace.
does
Yeah.
the existence of UNRWA prevent there being a possibility for peace, and whether its unique status regarding refugees, which I appreciate you referenced earlier, whether that makes the search for peace an impossibility?
The answer is yes. The very existence of UNRWA, as Dr. Einat Wilf, more than anyone, has shown in her book with Adi Schwartz, The War of Return, the essential book on this matter, has shown that UNRWA is a war-making agency. The whole purpose of UNRWA is to tell Palestinians not that you have a home in Gaza, be peaceful, build a future. Gaza has beautiful beaches, make it Tel Aviv 2.0. No, they tell them your whole point is you're going to dismantle Israel, the right of return. And the people who invaded Israel, Hamas or the civilians, most of them were educated at UNRWA and thought that they were manifesting their UNRWA supported, endorsed, legitimized right of return. So the very existence of UNRWA, whether it's in Gaza or in Lebanon or in Jordan, is a war-making agency and is the very opposite of the possibility for peace.
Hello, I'm tremendously grateful to you for joining us and for all of the work that you and your colleagues at UNWatch continue to do in putting this information out into the public domain. Lots of questioners have remarked on how little of this information seems to be getting through. So thank you for your continued efforts in this regard, and look forward to having you back on a future date for updates. This is a very quickly moving area, so appreciate you informing our audience of this important material. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, and I want to thank you and UKLFI for the tremendous work that you are all doing, and it's a pleasure for me to join you today.
Take care.